The Galactic Academy of Sciences stood as the most prestigious institution of learning in the entire Orion sector, attracting the brightest minds from hundreds of advanced civilizations. Within its vast, domed lecture halls, beings of all forms gathered to push the boundaries of knowledge, each species boasting their own superior intellect, enhanced evolution, or advanced technological modifications. Humans were a rarity here, often regarded with mild amusement or outright condescension. Their biology was fragile, their technology primitive, and their cognitive abilities, while adaptive, were deemed vastly inferior to those of the galaxy's leading intellects. Professor Zyron, a towering Valdorian, stood before the gathered students, his deep violet exoskeleton gleaming under the Academy's artificial lights. His species, known for their cybernetic integration and precision in data analysis, prided themselves on logical superiority. His multi-lensed eyes scanned the hall, taking in the rows of students from countless worlds. The air hummed with the whispers of telepathic beings, the occasional flicker of bioluminescent signals between species, and the low hum of artificial cognition from those who had long since abandoned purely organic thought. He raised one of his forearms, signaling for silence. Today, he announced, his voice reverberating through the hall, "We shall determine, once and for all, the limits of biological computation." A murmur of interest rippled through the crowd. Many had anticipated this moment, a test designed to showcase the intellectual hierarchy of the known galaxy. Professor Zyron had spent years perfecting the challenge, crafting it with the latest quantum generators to ensure absolute fairness. Every student would be pitted against the Academy's cutting-edge AI, a system so advanced that even the finest Valdorian minds struggled to match its precision. The objective was simple: solve a series of equations in the shortest time possible. The AI would serve as the benchmark. No organic being had ever come close to its processing speed. Seated at the far edge of the hall, Jimmy Lewis watched in silence. He was one of only 3 humans enrolled in the Academy this cycle, and by far the least remarkable, or so it seemed. Unlike his counterparts, he lacked cybernetic enhancements or genetic modifications. His brain, as far as the Academy was concerned, was purely organic. No artificial synapses, no direct neural interfaces, just the raw, unfiltered cognition of an earthborn mind. He had kept to himself for most of the term, often overlooked by his alien peers, some of whom barely acknowledged his presence. As the professor continued explaining the parameters of the challenge, Jimmy exhaled slowly. He had grown accustomed to being underestimated. The alien students around him, many of whom had integrated quantum processors into their cognitive functions, exchanged smug glances. To them, this was more of an exhibition than a test, another opportunity to assert their superiority. Zyron gestured toward the massive holographic display behind him. The AI interface flickered to life, a shifting mass of pulsating data streams forming an intricate lattice of calculations. Numbers cascaded across the screen in rapid succession, demonstrating the speed at which the system operated. The professor's voice carried a note of finality as he turned back to the students. "This is the Supermind Challenge," he declared, "a test of pure computational ability, no external tools, no assistance, just your minds against the ultimate intelligence." The first round was meant as a warm-up. Simple calculations appeared in glowing text above each student's personal terminal. The aliens dove into their work, fingers moving with inhuman speed, biosynaptic processors enhancing their cognitive responses. The AI solved each equation in a fraction of a second, while the fastest organic participants completed them within 2. Jimmy took his time, his fingers barely moving as he calculated each answer mentally before submitting them with a deliberate tap. A chuckle arose from the students seated near him. Azelthran, his skin shifting through iridescent hues, smirked in Jimmy's direction. Humans are still using manual input? How quaint. Jimmy ignored him. He had never cared much for the posturing of those who believed intelligence was solely a matter of processing speed. The second round began and the equations became more complex. Multidimensional matrices, probability collapse scenarios, fractal encryption sequences. The AI, unsurprisingly, completed them instantly. The fastest students trailed closely behind. Jimmy, still at a measured pace, continued to input his answers without any visible urgency. By the third round, some of the slower species were beginning to falter, their neural pathways struggling to keep up with the increasing complexity. Professor Zyron observed the results with clinical detachment, making mental notes on the rankings. It was exactly as he had expected. The Valdorians and Zelthrans led the competition, followed by the neural-enhanced Eutalians. Humans remained near the bottom, their processing speeds nowhere near that of the superior species. And then came the impossible equation. The challenge had been designed as a definitive cutoff point, separating even the most advanced organic minds from true computational brilliance. No student had ever solved it in less than 5 minutes. Even the AI took a full second to process it, a near eternity for machine intelligence. The equation unfolded across the display, shifting in real time, a vast and complex problem that required simultaneous calculations across multiple dimensions. The hall fell into concentrated silence as students grappled with the overwhelming complexity. Fingers twitched across interfaces, bioprocessors fired at maximum capacity. Beads of sweat formed on the organic participants, while the cybernetic-enhanced beings pushed their neural interfaces to their absolute limit. The AI computed its solution and displayed it almost immediately. No one was surprised. The real question was who among them could come closest to its speed. 30 seconds passed. 1 minute. 2. And then Jimmy submitted his answer. Professor Zyron's head jerked up sharply. He barely had time to process the fact that the human had even responded before the terminal confirmed correctness. The hall fell deathly silent. The professor's lenses dilated in shock as he double-checked the result. There was no mistake. The answer was flawless. Jimmy Lewis had just solved the impossible equation in 10 seconds. Not only had he beaten every other student in the room, he had come dangerously close to the AI's record. The other students stared in disbelief. A few Zelthrans turned to each other in hushed whispers, their shifting skin betraying their unease. Even the neural-enhanced beings, who had long dismissed humans as cognitively inferior, now looked at Jimmy with something akin to wariness. Zyron, his voice devoid of its usual authority, finally spoke. "This is impossible." Jimmy met his gaze without hesitation. Is it? For the first time since the Academy's founding, a human had disrupted the established hierarchy of intelligence. And the professor, for all his knowledge and precision, had no idea how it had just happened. Professor Zyron stood frozen, his multifaceted eyes locked onto the screen that displayed the impossible truth. The answer was correct. The calculations had been verified twice, and there was no sign of error. Yet the fact remained. Jimmy Lewis, a human without enhancements, had just solved a problem that no organic being had ever answered so quickly. The air in the lecture hall felt heavier, filled with a mix of disbelief, unease, and unspoken challenge. The quiet murmur of alien students rippled through the room, their voices edged with confusion. The professor's rigid form finally moved. His exoskeleton emitted a faint clicking sound as he turned toward Jimmy. The expression on his face was unreadable, but the sharpness in his voice made it clear that he refused to accept what had just happened without scrutiny. "Stand," Zyron ordered. Jimmy remained seated for a moment, his gaze steady. He had known from the moment he pressed submit that this reaction was inevitable. Slowly, he rose from his seat. The eyes of every student in the hall followed him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Some of the cybernetically enhanced species twitched slightly, their neural connections undoubtedly firing at full capacity, analyzing the situation from every angle. The Valdorians exchanged quick glances, their artificial optics narrowing in suspicion. Explain how you arrived at your answer, Xeron demanded. His voice was calm, but there was a tightness to it, a rigid control that barely concealed the storm beneath. Jimmy didn't flinch. He had expected this too. He had spent his entire life surrounded by beings who assumed they were superior, and he had learned long ago that nothing frustrated them more than a simple, undeniable truth. "I recognize the pattern," Jimmy said. Silence. Xeron's lenses contracted slightly. "Clarify." Jimmy exhaled through his nose. He could feel the weight of the room pressing in on him. The equation was complex, but it had structural similarities to recursive fractal sequences I studied back on Earth. I didn't solve it step by step. I saw the pattern emerge before I even finished reading the full problem. A murmur spread through the hall, growing louder. A Zelthran female near the front crossed her arms, her bioluminescent markings shifting in color. "That's absurd," she muttered. "No biological brain can process an equation of that complexity without direct neural acceleration." Jimmy didn't respond. He knew better than to argue. The more he spoke, the more he would feed their disbelief. Instead, he waited. Professor Xeron didn't take his gaze off him. The Valdorian's mind was working rapidly, cycling through possible explanations. If Jimmy had somehow found a shortcut, it would still take significant mental power to process the information fast enough to solve it within 10 seconds. But a human, unaided by technology? Impossible. "You will do it again," Xeron said, his voice firm. "Now, with a newly generated equation." Jimmy nodded. He had known this was coming. He turned back toward his terminal, his fingers resting lightly on the interface as the professor gestured toward the Academy's AI system. "Generate a new Level 5 supermind equation," Xeron instructed. The AI complied instantly. A fresh problem unfolded across the screen, a swirling array of data lines forming an intricate mathematical challenge that twisted across multiple dimensions of logic. The equation was designed to be unpredictable, ensuring that prior knowledge or memorization would be useless. The other students leaned forward, watching closely. They were no longer just interested, they were invested. If Jimmy failed now, it would confirm what they had suspected, that his previous success had been a fluke, an accident, or outright fraud. But if he succeeded again, the numbers shifted, rearranging themselves into an unfathomable sequence. The AI finished its own calculation in just under a second. The correct answer hovered silently above the terminal. Jimmy's eyes moved over the equation. He barely blinked. Then he typed. His fingers moved swiftly but without haste. There was no hesitation, no apparent struggle. He was done in 8 seconds. The moment he pressed submit, the hall plunged into a stunned silence. Professor Xeron's exoskeleton made a sharp, involuntary clicking sound. He didn't need to verify the answer. He knew it was correct. The AI confirmed it anyway, displaying the validation sequence in glowing text. The silence stretched unbearably. Then, from somewhere in the hall, someone whispered, "How?" Xeron exhaled sharply, his rigid posture betraying the tension in his system. His species prided itself on absolute logic, and right now, there was no logical explanation for what had just happened. "You are using an external system," Xeron said at last. "Some form of hidden neural link." Jimmy shook his head. "I'm not." The professor's voice darkened. "That level of speed is beyond your species' recorded cognitive capabilities. Maybe your records are incomplete," Jimmy replied evenly. A sharp intake of breath came from the students. The sheer audacity of the statement hung in the air. Xeron's gaze flickered. It was true that humans had not been extensively studied by the higher academic circles. They had been deemed unremarkable. Resilient, yes. Adaptive, certainly. But intellectually, the assumption had always been that they were inferior to species with more evolved neural pathways. And yet, Jimmy had just demonstrated something that defied that classification. "Again!" Xeron ordered. Jimmy smirked slightly. "How many times do I need to prove it?" "As many times as it takes for me to find the flaw," Xeron replied. His voice was flat, but there was something new in it, a hint of unease. The professor gestured again. The AI generated another equation, even more complex than the last. It shimmered in the air, a twisting nightmare of advanced calculus and abstract logic, something that should take minutes to process, even for the most advanced minds in the room. Jimmy barely glanced at it. He typed. 7 seconds. The room exploded into noise. This time, students weren't just murmuring. They were outright arguing, their voices rising in disbelief, frustration, even anger. Some accused Jimmy of trickery. Others insisted it was an anomaly. A few, the more observant ones, were silent, their expressions thoughtful rather than outraged. Professor Zyron watched it all, unmoving. His mind, so used to operating in precise, predictable sequences, was now facing a paradox. Jimmy Lewis had just outperformed every known species in raw computational speed. The implications were enormous. For the first time in his career, Zyron was faced with a question he could not answer, and he hated it. Professor Zyron remained still, his towering form rigid as the tension in the lecture hall thickened. The noise from the students had yet to settle, voices overlapping in a cacophony of disbelief, accusation, and frustration. Some called for immediate disqualification, others demanded an investigation, but a select few had grown eerily quiet, their minds racing with the same realization that had begun to take hold in the professor's own thoughts. What if the human was telling the truth? Zyron's lenses adjusted, zooming in on Jimmy Lewis's face. The young man's expression was unreadable, his posture relaxed, despite the maelstrom of hostility around him. There was no arrogance in his stance, no sign of a hidden transmitter or neural implant, nothing that would suggest deception. The professor's suspicion deepened. If Jimmy had been using an external device, there would have been telltale signs. Delayed responses, unnatural eye movements, a break in focus as the information was relayed to his brain. Yet his concentration had been absolute. Zyron raised a hand, demanding silence. The hall obeyed, though the restless energy remained palpable. His voice was steady when he spoke. The integrity of the academy is absolute. If any student has bypassed protocol, we will find out. Lewis will be tested under controlled conditions. A murmur of approval spread through the hall. Jimmy met Zyron's gaze but said nothing. He had expected this. He knew that no matter how many times he repeated his performance, the professor would not accept it without exhausting every possibility of fraud. Zyron gestured sharply, and the room's lighting shifted. The surrounding walls rippled, their smooth metallic surfaces retracting to reveal an intricate network of scanning devices. The Academy was equipped with the most sophisticated technology in the Orion sector, capable of detecting even the slightest anomalies in cognitive function. No deception could survive under this level of scrutiny. "Approach the verification terminal," Zyron commanded. Jimmy moved without hesitation, stepping onto the raised platform at the front of the hall. The scanning devices activated immediately, beams of translucent energy sweeping over his body, mapping every neurological signal, every muscle twitch, every minuscule fluctuation in brain activity. The readout displayed in real time, projected in the air for all to see. Zyron studied the data as it materialized. No foreign implants, no external computational assistance. Jimmy's brainwaves fluctuated naturally, undisturbed by artificial interference. The professor's fingers flexed at his sides. That did not rule out deception entirely. There were still avenues left to explore. The AI interface reconfigured, displaying a new set of challenges. Zyron adjusted the parameters manually, ensuring that this time the equations would be dynamically generated, shifting unpredictably as they were solved. No pre-existing pattern recognition could help Jimmy now. "You will have 60 seconds, Zyron stated. "If you solve even one of these problems at the speed you demonstrated before, I will consider the possibility that your species is more than what we assumed. If you fail, You will be expelled for attempted fraud. A few students snickered, confident that this would be the moment the human was exposed. Jimmy remained silent. He had nothing to prove to them. He was only interested in the equation in front of him. The countdown began. The first problem materialized in shifting lines of code, morphing between dimensions as the AI scrambled it in real time. Even the fastest Valdorian would need at least 20 seconds to reach a solution. Jimmy's gaze flicked across the projection. He entered the answer in 6 seconds. Zyron's exoskeleton clicked involuntarily. The AI validated the answer. Correct. The second problem shifted into view, an even more complex variation, expanding with recursive layers of calculations. Jimmy typed before the symbols had fully stabilized. 5 seconds. The room held its breath. The third problem generated. Its structure deliberately erratic, meant to force the solver to abandon pattern recognition and resort to brute force calculation. Jimmy barely seemed to notice. His fingers flew over the interface. 4 seconds. Zyron's lenses dilated. The timer had 20 seconds remaining. Jimmy had already completed 3 of the 5 problems, each with increasing speed. The professor's mind struggled to reconcile what he was witnessing. He had spent decades refining the art of intellectual assessment, designing tests meant to push the limits of organic cognition. No species, not even the most advanced cybernetic hybrids, had ever performed like this, and yet here stood a human, doing the impossible as if it required no effort at all. The fourth equation manifested, fractal layers spiraling outward into a puzzle of incomprehensible magnitude. Jimmy exhaled slowly and input the answer. 3 seconds. A sharp sound echoed through the hall, Zyron's fingers involuntarily clenching against his exoskeleton. A reaction he had not experienced in over 200 years. The final equation appeared, its complexity surpassing all logic. A problem that should take even the AI multiple seconds to compute. The moment it stabilized, Jimmy's hands moved. 2 seconds. The counter hit 0. The results flashed in the air. 5 equations, 5 correct answers. A new record in the history of the Academy. Silence. The students who had mocked Jimmy moments ago looked as if they had forgotten how to breathe. Even the neural-enhanced species, the ones who had spent centuries believing their intellect was untouchable, had nothing to say. Zyron remained motionless. His internal systems ran every conceivable analysis, yet the conclusion remained the same. Jimmy Lewis had just shattered every known boundary of biological intelligence. The professor's voice, when it finally emerged, was quiet but edged with something dangerously close to reverence. "What are you?" Jimmy met his gaze, his expression calm. "Just human." A whisper of disbelief swept through the room. But this time it was different. This was no longer mockery, no longer condescension. This was fear. Zyron remained motionless, his multi-lensed eyes fixed on Jimmy Lewis, as if searching for something beyond the flesh and bone of a human student. The tension in the hall had solidified, no longer charged with disbelief, but something far heavier. There had been no mistake, no trickery, no hidden technology. Jimmy had done the impossible, and now the professor had no choice but to confront the implications. The silence stretched unbearably before Zyron finally spoke. "You will explain," he said, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance, replaced instead with an edge of unease. "Now." Jimmy regarded him for a long moment before giving a small nod. "Fine." He exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair before he turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the lecture hall. He could feel every set of eyes locked onto him, watching, waiting, trying to understand. "The problem," Jimmy began, his voice steady, "is that you assume intelligence is about computation." His words cut through the air like a blade. "You think faster processing, more connections, bigger neural networks mean superiority. But that's not how humans work." Zyron's exoskeleton shifted slightly, a subtle movement that betrayed his discomfort. Explain. Jimmy gestured toward the holographic display still lingering in the air. You designed those problems to be solved through brute force calculation, right? A step-by-step breakdown of variables and probabilities, something an AI or a cybernetic mind would approach with raw processing power. His lips curled slightly. But humans don't always solve problems that way. Sometimes we just see the answer. A murmur ran through the students, some exchanging confused glances, others leaning in closer as if proximity alone would help them understand what he meant. Xiron, however, remained unreadable. "Pattern recognition?" he asked, though it was clear he did not believe that alone could explain what had happened. "Not just that," Jimmy corrected. "It's something deeper, a mix of intuition, creativity, subconscious logic. When I looked at those equations, I wasn't breaking them down into raw data. I was recognizing structures, anticipating shifts before they fully formed. The way an artist sees an image before they paint it, the way a musician hears a song before playing a single note." The hall fell deathly silent again. That answer made no sense to the species present. Intelligence had always been about measurable metrics, something to be quantified, refined, augmented. But what Jimmy described? That was something different, something that defied their understanding of cognition itself. Xiron tilted his head slightly. "Are you claiming that your mind operates outside logical computation?" "Not outside it," Jimmy said, shaking his head, "but beyond it." Xiron's fingers flexed against his sides, his mind racing through every scientific model he had studied, every documented case of neural cognition in the known galaxy. No species, none, had ever demonstrated something like this. If Jimmy was telling the truth, if this wasn't some anomaly unique to him alone, then it meant humans possessed a fundamental form of intelligence that had never been properly studied. The implications were staggering. "You are saying," Xiron said slowly, measuring each word, "that humans perceive mathematical structures the way others perceive art?" "Sometimes," Jimmy replied. "Not always. But when it happens, it's like seeing a picture in its entirety, instead of assembling it piece by piece." A sharp laugh came from the side of the room. A Zelthran male, his bioluminescent skin pulsing erratically, crossed his arms. "Ridiculous. You expect us to believe you felt your way through the equations? That's absurd. If this were true, humans would have been at the forefront of intellectual advancement centuries ago. But you are not. Your species is primitive." Jimmy turned his gaze toward him, expression unreadable. "Maybe we were too busy surviving to prove ourselves in an academic pissing contest." A ripple of tension moved through the room. The Zelthran narrowed his eyes but said nothing. Xiron's mind continued calculating possibilities, searching for flaws in the logic. Why has this ability not been documented? Jimmy exhaled sharply. "Because we don't know how to quantify it. We can't measure intuition the same way you measure computation speed. And even among humans it varies. Some people have it stronger than others. But when it happens, it's real." He gestured toward the equations, "and I just proved it." Xiron fell silent. He knew he could not deny that. For the first time in his career, he was looking at something that challenged the very foundation of his understanding. Jimmy had exposed a blind spot in the way the Academy, and perhaps the entire galactic community, viewed intelligence. The assumption had always been that raw speed, logical sequencing, and enhanced cognitive networks defined superiority. But this was something different. The implications stretched beyond the Academy. If humans truly possessed a unique form of perception that allowed them to see answers before fully calculating them, then it meant the current models of intelligence ranking were fundamentally flawed. It meant humans, despite being biologically weaker and technologically behind, had a cognitive edge that no other species had ever recognized, and that made them dangerous. Xiron turned to the AI, his voice cold. "Project neural mapping of Lewis's brain during problem-solving." The holographic display shifted, revealing the raw data collected from the scans. Brainwaves pulsed in erratic, unpredictable bursts, moving in ways that defied logical patterns. Zyron's eyes narrowed. It wasn't just complex, it was chaotic. Yet somehow, within that chaos, the answers had emerged faster than any structured computational process. A low hum spread through the hall as the students stared at the visualized data. This was unlike anything they had ever seen. The professor did not look away. Jimmy watched him carefully. "What do you see?" Zyron's voice was quieter this time. Something that should not exist. A chill ran through the room. For the first time, the Academy's belief in its own intellectual superiority had been shaken. And Jimmy knew that from this moment forward, nothing would ever be the same. Zyron did not speak for several moments, his eyes fixed on the holographic projection of Jimmy's neural mapping. His mind, built upon centuries of logical frameworks, was attempting to find a way to fit this revelation into something structured, something explainable. But the more he studied the data, the more he realized the fundamental flaw in his approach. This was beyond structure. Jimmy remained standing on the raised platform, his expression unreadable. He could feel the weight of the room pressing in on him, dozens of minds working in overdrive, trying to rationalize something that refused to be rationalized. He had seen this reaction before. Not here, not among aliens, but back on Earth, when people were confronted with ideas that shattered their beliefs. It was always the same. First disbelief, then denial, then something far more dangerous. Zyron finally straightened. This changes everything. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the hall like a warning. A murmur of unease spread through the students. The ranking system of the Academy, the rigid classifications of intellect that had been upheld for generations, had just been challenged. If humans were capable of this kind of cognition, then it meant every assumption the Academy had made about intelligence was flawed. And if that was true, then the entire structure of intergalactic academia, the way species were categorized, the way progress was measured, all of it was wrong. A Zeltharan student near the front leaned forward, his bioluminescent skin flickering erratically. "Then humans have been hiding their capabilities," he said, his voice sharp. "If what Lewis did is real, if all humans have this potential, then why was it never demonstrated before? Why has your species remained behind for so long?" Jimmy exhaled through his nose, already anticipating this line of thought. "Because no one was looking," he said. "You didn't study humans for their intellect, you studied our physical limitations, our lack of enhancements, our short lifespans. You assumed that because we weren't optimizing ourselves the way you were, we weren't capable of competing at your level. So, no one asked the right questions. No one bothered to measure us in ways that mattered." The room fell silent again. Zyron's fingers twitched slightly before he folded his arms across his chest. "And what do you think will happen now that we have measured it?" Jimmy met his gaze without hesitation. "That depends on how much you fear what you don't understand." A flicker of something unreadable passed through Zyron's expression. The reality of the situation was settling in. The Academy was not just a place of learning, it was a gatekeeper. It decided which species were considered intellectually superior, which were granted access to the highest levels of research, which were allowed to contribute to the expansion of knowledge across the known galaxy. If humans had been underestimated, if their abilities had been overlooked, then it meant the entire system had been compromised. And that was not something the Academy would allow to go unchallenged. A cold realization settled in Jimmy's stomach. He had forced their hand. He had made himself a problem. Zyron turned to the AI interface, his voice sharper now. "Archive all records of this session. Restrict access under Security Protocol Omega-4. Jimmy's jaw tightened. He was being erased. One of the other students, a Utalian with deep violet eyes, straightened in her seat. "Professor," she said cautiously, "is that necessary?" Zyron didn't look at her. "Until further review, this information will remain classified." Jimmy took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "So that's it? You're going to pretend this never happened? Zyron's lenses shifted slightly, his body language betraying a trace of hesitation. You misunderstand, Lewis. This is not about denial. It is about control. Jimmy felt something cold coil in his chest. Of course, it wasn't that Zyron refused to believe him. It wasn't that the Academy would ignore what had happened. It was that they would decide how it was revealed, if it was revealed at all. They wouldn't allow something like this to disrupt the hierarchy they had built. If humans were to be acknowledged as intellectual competitors, it would not be on their own terms. Jimmy clenched his fists. And if I refuse to let this be buried? Zyron studied him for a long moment. Then, with deliberate precision, he said, "Then you will learn the difference between being an anomaly and being a threat." The words were quiet, but they struck like a hammer, a warning, a promise. Jimmy's pulse pounded in his ears. He had spent most of his life being underestimated, being dismissed as something lesser. But this was different. The Academy wasn't dismissing him anymore. It was afraid of him, and fear made powerful people dangerous. A slow smile pulled at Jimmy's lips. Not out of amusement, not even out of defiance, but because he had won. No matter what Zyron did, no matter how the Academy tried to control the narrative, the truth was out. The students in this room would not forget what they had seen. Even if the official records were locked away, whispers would spread, and once an idea like this took root, nothing could stop it from growing. Jimmy turned, stepping down from the platform. As he walked toward the exit, every eye in the room followed him, some with awe, some with resentment, some with something far more dangerous: calculation. The doors slid open as he reached them. He paused, casting one final glance back at Zyron. "You can classify this all you want," he said, "but you can't stop what happens next." Then he walked out. Behind him, the Academy was left to grapple with the single most terrifying realization it had ever faced. Humans weren't just competitors, they were the future.